Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, AC Sedgwick. This time, I'm pleased to introduce to you Sacha Coward, a queer historian who's been working in museums for the past 15 years. He's currently working on his first book, which is a queer history of mythology and folklore called Queer As Folklore, and I really hope that you enjoy this interview. Hello, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. Something got all awkward. Forgot how to introduce myself. I'm doing really well. Thank you so much for having me on here. Really excited to have a chat with you today.
Well, you were actually requested, so there's always that.
Love that. Love to be a request.
So, for anyone who doesn't know about your book, do you want to tell us about your book? Is it Queer as Folklore?
That's it, yeah. So I'm currently writing a book called Queer As Folklore. It's my first book. Turns out it's quite hard to write a book. Didn't realize. I thought it was easy, but all these people writing books saying it's bloody hard. They've actually not been lying. But Queer As Folklore is like an LGBTQ plus, so that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. All of those identities are under that umbrella. But looking at mythology and folklore throughout history, all the way from today, going back thousands of years, but looking at the connections with my community. So I'm a gay man, and since growing up, I've always been obsessed with mythical creatures and folklore. Now, I know a lot of your listeners, again, well, in fact, I hope most of your listeners will be obsessed with folklore in some way. And not all of you are going to be queer or queer adjacent, but there is something about our community that if you go, that let's imagine you go to a pride parade in any country in the world, you're going to see obviously rainbow flags, but you're going to see mermaids and you're going to see fairy wings, right? You're going to see men walking around with wolf tails, cat ears. You're going to see all of these symbols that are very much drawn from mythology. And if you think about the characters that drag queens play, and the kind of aesthetics of what is modern LGBT fashion, all of it, or at least a lot of it, comes from mythology and folklore. And I was really interested what connects like some 45-year-old in Soho singing Part of Your World from The Little Mermaid in a karaoke booth after a few too many gin and tonics to like the ancient goddess Atargatis. And I think there's a really interesting connection there. So the book is basically going through different mythical creatures. Each chapter roughly focuses on a different creature or being, and then explores it from an LGBT perspective. And my argument is not just that LGBT people have borrowed these images or resonate with them. That's pretty well known, right? We see ourselves in the monster. We see ourselves in something strange, but more that we actually helped create them. That LGBT people, even though they wouldn't have used those terms 1,000 years ago, but people who are not heterosexual or not traditionally just seen as cisgender, actually helped to write those stories, actually helped to craft and create the myths and folklore that we enjoy today. So that's the book in a rather large, over bloated nutshell.
So you mentioned before about how it's been harder to sort of do the research than you expected. So because you're looking at a huge time span, how difficult has it been to do the research, and sort of how you even begin to get started?
It is really tricky. It's so entertaining and it's so much fun. Like my poor husband, I start rabbiting about the weirdest stuff, like unicorn sex toys in the Victorian period, or suddenly, that must be quite disturbing when you're trying to do a Sunday roast and your husband comes downstairs completely looking, absolutely out of his mind and can't stop talking about like queer werewolves. But the issue is there's two things about it that make it challenging. One is that LGBTQ plus history is in itself really tricky. I've been an LGBT historian for about 15 years now, and I love researching these stories, but these are, by their very nature, stories that have been repressed, hidden, sometimes actively hidden by the people themselves to protect themselves. Throughout history, history is told through historians, right? Historians are the people who write things down, who gather sources, and then tell classrooms or lecture theatres, this is what history is. And those people for a very long time have traditionally, at least in the West, been white, cisgender, heterosexual men. And the story they tell about who we were has informed how we think our history was. And they've often just cut the corners off. I mean, the classic example being the Victorians. They hid away all of the Roman and Greek artifacts and artwork that was homoerotic, that they saw as perverse or indecent. And because of that, we've lost some of the accounts of our history. And the other issue is, whereas, you know, it's really lovely when you come across a lovely diary that someone has written, a first-hand source of their own experiences. These are very rare even for heterosexual, right, cis history. But for queer history, these diaries are often written in code. They're hidden, they're burnt after the person died, they are torn apart. They're very rarely a single piece. It's often really fragmentary, and you have to put these things together, try to piece together a life that has been actively hidden by so many different people over thousands of years. It is really, really challenging. And then the second part is the folklore part. So you take the weird goopiness of queer history and you amplify it through the fact that we're talking about myths. We're talking about people's stories that people told that they didn't necessarily write down. We're talking about ideas in people's heads. How do you work out what someone in, you know, the 12th century thought about fairies? How do you find that unless it's been codified in a manuscript? So these two like really ephemeral things that are kind of always in flux and changeable, and trying to construct something out of that makes sense. Because the last thing I want to do is just to write a really woolly book that's like, do you know what? Aren't fairies glittery and fabulous? They're really cool. And I bet maybe, possibly, someone a long time ago thought they were cool as well. That does nothing. I want to give something that has some foundations and some framework. So in terms of where I've been looking, I've gone to all of the queer historians who've already written stuff about this already. I'm so thankful that luckily I live in a time where there are actually quite a few people who've done some of the legwork first. The next thing is to look at some of the first-hand sources with a queer eye. So as a great example, I've been writing about werewolves recently, and there's a Roman festival that your listeners probably know about called the Lupercalia. A festival which descends from an ancient Greek festival about wolves and actually transforming into wolves. But the Roman version was very much a fertility festival. And when you read, you know, 19th or 20th century writers about it, all of them are men, they always write about how it's a fertility ritual for women, to help women become pregnant. And it was young men running naked through the street and like slapping women or kind of basically, but yeah, it was an incredibly pervy festival, even in its heterosexual form. But when you read the actual texts, you read a lot about how the fact that these young boys known as ephebes were chosen because they were perceived to be beautiful, and they would basically run around and touch and sort of molest anybody of any gender. And as we know in the Roman period, particularly amongst men, an attraction, a same-sex attraction, was not uncommon and was not necessarily vilified. As long as you were the more masculine or dominant partner, it was seen as perfectly respectable. And so you can see these examples of men writing about the Lupercalia and how it was just a very sexy time to see these hot young guys running around. So it's this kind of thing of going back to where the sources go and go, right, well, I know this has been written about by Lord such and such in 1895, but what do I see in this? What has been left out? And when they often quote something and they just stop the citation just there, what happens afterwards? And that's where you find the breadcrumb trail, I find.
Yeah, and I suppose when you look at a lot of even the myths from both Greece and Rome, I'm thinking anything involving Apollo or Zeus. They're just like loving in general. So I suppose they're probably quite good places to start.
Yeah, I mean, those myths and legends are probably, it's almost like the low-hanging fruit, but they are fantastic, right? A number of people have explored these. Stephen Fry recently has written about these in Mythos. You know, they're probably where the kind of homoeroticism, it's the easiest place to find it in ancient history, at least for us. It's often really problematic. Like Zeus was, you know, he was not a nice guy. And whether you were a man or a woman that he lusted after, you didn't really get a say in it. And so the experiences you read about, they're very, very dark. If you see them from a contemporary lens, like, this is not a healthy relationship he's having with anyone. But yeah, most of the great heroes, Hercules had loads of same-sex lovers. I mean, the great example is Achilles and Patroclus, who, it's really weird when you read about even historians today describing them as like brothers in arms and like really good friends, and then you look at the pottery and you're like, gross. Like, I really hope that's not how you see a sibling relationship, because it's very clear that these two were sharing beds, that they were having a romantic and sexual relationship, which doesn't preclude them from also falling in love with women. If anything, you know, to put a very broad stroke brush, Roman and Greek culture, at least for men, because it was still deeply patriarchal and misogynistic, was highly pansexual. It was just kind of sexual. They had all their own rules and things about who you were allowed to sleep with. You know, if you were a man of high standing, then hopefully the man that you were with was younger than you, was of less standing than you. To be the passive partner in a sexual relationship between two men was definitely something that was seen as ridiculable. You know, people like Caesar, Mark Antony were mocked, or one of the ways that people would cast aspersions on them was to imply that they were the passive partner with another man. So it is complex, but those places are obviously a nice place to start. But then from there, you look at pretty much any folklore. So if you look at Japanese mythology, Chinese mythology, Maori mythology, it's all there. The general, like, it feels like the base being of storytelling for humans is a sort of pansexuality where anything can happen. And it's only when we've imposed these kind of strange limits on how relationships should be shown, and what is a good relationship and what is a healthy relationship, what is a godly relationship, that we start to cut the corners off and we sand off the edges, and we create this very weird heteronormative look on history. I guess that's one of my big beefs, is that you often hear that people like me, queer historians, feminist historians, black historians, are like changing history, are like, we're trying to alter it. What I think is, from my perspective, is heteronormative history has already been changed. It's not history in its purest form. It's gone through the mind of a person with certain presumptions and desires, and what you get is not the pure history. What we are doing as historians is kind of going, what did you miss out there? What was the thing you overlooked? What was your interpretation? Why did you say that these two were brothers? What led you to that conclusion? When what I see as a gay man is two men who were clearly in love. So yeah, it's the Greeks are a great place to start. Another thing that's really interesting is to look at some of the authors and the writers of fairy tales and mythology. So Hans Christian Andersen being a classic example of what we would today maybe call a bisexual writer. He wrote love letters to men and women. To Mary Shelley, who creates, you know, Frankenstein, and her writing about the fact that she would often get, quote, tousy mousy with women and girls. Like, it's clear that a lot of the people constructing these narratives, these stories, Bram Stoker is another one. These are all people who today, and I use this carefully, might fall under that LGBTQ plus umbrella.
And then, of course, you've got people like the marvelous Oscar Wilde, who, I think, you know, I mean, a lot of the stories he's created, while they're not necessarily folklore specific, like, obviously he takes his inspiration from the Gothic quite a lot, but, you know, I don't think he's shy in promoting his particular, not promote, that's the wrong word, but including his own point of view in things, which obviously didn't end well for him.
No, Oscar Wilde is, again, a fascinating one, because he had connections with Bram Stoker, and there's a lot. So one of the biographers of Bram Stoker has implied that Bram was possibly a closeted gay or bisexual man. We know that Bram wrote a letter to another man where he basically said, if you know the meaning of this letter, then keep this. If you do not, then please burn it. very coded messages there. But he was friends with Oscar Wilde, and after seeing what happened to Oscar, it's argued that Brum himself basically tried to hide his sexuality by becoming incredibly homophobic and writing letters that suggested that there were loads of horrible sodomites writing things. Not me, of course, but loads of other people. You know, the impact of Oscar Wilde's writing, his life, and also his persecution on other people, it sent a lot of people back into the closet. But it also inspired others, and it's worth saying. So Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Little Mermaid, this was a story ostensibly written for children, like a moral story. It was written after heartbreak of being basically rejected by another man. And this story was taken by a number of people, including Oscar Wilde, who rewrote it as The Fisherman and His Soul. So the fact that Oscar saw a children's story and was like, I'm going to create my own version of this, says something about what we still do today. And the artist Evelyn de Morgan, who again today may well have been described as bisexual, painted a painting of one of her muses and arguably one of her lovers as the sisters of Ariel in The Little Mermaid, although she's just called the Little Mermaid in the story. So yeah, it's like all these authors, they're not in a vacuum. They're all influencing each other. They're all watching each other. And if you can imagine being gay or queer or trans or whatever in that time period, you are watching the case of Oscar Wilde very carefully, because it tells you about how you might be treated if you get caught. So yeah, these things have ripples. They're often networks of people who are very closely connected to each other, responding to each other's stories and creating the narratives that we see today.
I love Evelyn de Morgan's work, mind. I always sort of think it's such a shame that she's not quite as well known, I think, as some of her contemporaries, considering just like a sheer level of talent. Yeah. But yeah, I love Evelyn de Morgan.
They're gorgeous, but partly because you see like a woman's gaze. So you see like the naked female form not painted by a man, and it's very different. I really like that.
Yeah, because I know I did an episode about her work, like kind of position her with the pre-Raphaelites, I think it was. I think I did that, yeah. And yeah, it was that sort of sense of how do the myths that she represented, how do they then differ based on obviously her painting them rather than so when she does the one of Clytie who's turned into the sunflower, there's such a degree of pathos in Evelyn's compared to the male version that was painted, where she's kind of portrayed as being like, how do I put it? A bit of a silly girl, shall we say? And I think that there's and this is the thing when you even look at the art. I think because obviously art history is my background. I think people could probably got away with hiding a lot more in paintings. Because a lot of people would just look at them and go, "Oh, that's a nice painting," and like the Mina would just go whoosh.
Yeah, I it's funny. I've just come across a really interesting example of that. So there's the story. I'm trying to remember her name now. She's the nymph that's turned into the bear. Her name is not Callisto. Callisto.
No, it is Callisto, yeah.
Yeah, Callisto. So the story of Callisto being that she was a nymph who was kind of following Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, and was not interested in any man. Again, my reading of this is either like a lesbian woman or an asexual woman, depending how you see it, but her devotion is to Artemis and she's not interested in anyone else. And of course, down comes Zeus, classic. He's rejected, and so he transforms himself to look just like Artemis and basically assaults poor Callisto, right? It's not a nice story, but the excuse then was to paint two women kissing, because you have Callisto and you have Zeus in the form of Artemis. But what you end up with is all these paintings which ostensibly show two women having sex. And you know, the excuse is, oh no, because it's a Greek myth and actually it's the god in disguise. So all of that classical like academia hides the fact and allows artists maybe to get away with a certain amount of nonconformity. Greek myths and Roman stories allow people to toy with homoerotic themes in their work and pass it on, be able to say, no, I'm not being weird, I'm just painting it's a myth, it's very highbrow actually, you just don't get it. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's quite interesting to see how queer people use some of these stories, like the sisters of Ariel in Evelyn de Morgan's painting, the Sea Maidens, which is hanging at, in the Queen's house in Greenwich, they're all languishing all over each other. They're all bare-chested. They're all beautiful. They're all basically stroking each other in a highly erotic, suggestive way. But they also look at the viewer, who I presume is presumed to be a male viewer, with boredom. Like, it's kind of like they're like, oh, you again. Why are you here? And I love that, because Evelyn's got away with creating this incredibly erotic, there is no man in this painting. It is just women together being sensual. And she's used the mermaid myth to kind of go, oh no, it's just a scene from a mermaid story, which allows you to get away with it. I love that.
So mermaids do sort of feature quite prominently, because I know when I was looking at different sort of interviews that you've done before and stuff, and obviously mermaids keep coming up, and I've done mermaids before on the podcast, so like I'm quite the fan. Why do you think that sort of mer people, as we'll call them, obviously to sort of include other types of fin folk, why would you say that they're so prevalent both in folklore around the world, because so many places have legends of them, but then also within queer stories as well?
So mermaids were my gateway drug. So because I loved mermaids, I was always too embarrassed to like have a mermaid Barbie or anything. I wish I was the kind of gay that was a little bit more like outspoken, but I hid it quite well. Well, I tried to, until I was like well into like 18 or 19. But I loved The Little Mermaid, and I loved the scene with Ursula in particular. I just loved that song. I loved everything about it. Like, there's no wonder I love drag shows today. I was a 9-year-old and I was watching Ursula. That's a drag show. You see her putting her makeup on in the mirror. It's inspired by Divine, the drag queen from the 80s. So yeah, I think from a contemporary sense, there is a fabulous gayness or queerness to mermaids. One of the things being that as a young man, like trying to come to terms with my own sexuality, seeing a merman was one of the few times I would see like a topless man on television. Now, as women, like I'm sure you're like eye rolling, because like the female form in like the 90s and early 2000s was so eroticized and was on every billboard, on TV, on magazines. But as a gay man, like I was supposed to be attracted to that. But the only times I could come across it safely were in like mermaid stories, where there were all these hot topless men who were suggestively topless because they were mermen. So it was kind of like, again, a secret way for me to kind of go, I like that. I kind of like that. I don't know why. In terms of like the ancient stories, and I'm going to use like a really like pretentious term, but it's the best one I can think of. It's like liminality. So apologies, right? Yeah, I know it does come up in the book, but I try to define it. So liminal spaces, right? They're the spaces between things. A classic example is a dentist waiting room is a liminal space. Yeah, or an elevator, or like one of those things that doesn't quite, before you get into one space and into another. But liminal things aren't just spaces, they're ideas. They're the thing where you're just about to transform or change. A great example being adolescence is a liminal space. It's a time between two things. And these things feel weird. They feel odd, because as humans, we like things to be defined, right? We're all about boxes and archetypes. And we could get into queerness here, right? We like male and female. We like this and that. We like to define things. Liminality is that weird space in between. And a lot of folklore exists in what I would call like a liminal space. But the mermaid, right? She's half human, half fish. She transforms. Her very story is land and water. It is that weird thing that is in flux. A mermaid is constantly in flux. She is a symbol of transformation and change. From the York of indigenous Australian peoples to the Nino of Japan, the mermaid is often a symbol of transformation. And I think queer people who see themselves like to be queer, whether that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, non-binary, asexual, demisexual, any of these terms, is to live in that liminal space, to see that society has set out these words and these categories for what a man is and what a woman is and how you should behave, and to live secretly in between. And when you see another creature that is also of that weird in between, I think there's just a natural connection. And yet that's all very art school and like, you know, GCSE philosophy essay, but there's something about that transformation and change and the mixture of two worlds that I think for thousands of years has inspired people to play with the flexibility of human sexuality and gender.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Ursula though, because I mean, even when I was a kid, like Ursula was like my second favorite Disney character. My favorite clearly being Maleficent. I stan Maleficent.
Yeah.
And I always thought it was really funny that like Ursula in a lot of ways, like I like to read her, and this is my own theory, that she's actually totally aware that Eric is not really the best person that Ariel could end up with. And in a way, like she's kind of trying to save Ariel from herself by giving her this weird task that is almost obviously going to be doomed to fail. And it's kind of like Ursula knows it's a fool's errand. And obviously she's trying to get back at Triton, and we don't know why. Clearly, there's beef between them. But I always like to try and think of Ursula as like a slightly weird take on the fairy godmother, and I just think that makes her even more cool.
I think she's fascinating in the Disney version because originally they were going to make her this wizened old crone because she's a sea witch, and the classic image of a witch is haggard and gnarled. And by you know, partly being inspired by a drag queen, but then, you know, being voiced by a larger, vivacious woman, they've created this character who a lot of people see themselves in. So queer people see the drag side, the putting on the makeup, the the drama, you know, the body language, like it's a drag performance. I see that a lot of Black women and women of color see this larger, like assertive woman, the hairstyle, the cut. It's not a traditional waifish Caucasian coded Disney princess. And a lot of like women see this character who refuses to be sexy for men, who is not out to get the guy. She's out to get the guy, as in to like shank him in the back, and perhaps seeing like a very successful businesswoman as well, like dealing in contracts. So there's, again, seeing the villain and flipping it is common to a lot of communities. We can see like, oh, you want us to hate this character, but actually she's beloved because she's so much more interesting. She's got more drive. It's not just that she's in love. You're like, oh, what's going on there? What's her backstory? Why does she hate Triton? What's her skin in this game? That I think makes her really fascinating.
Yeah, somebody online mentioned that when you sort of see her when she takes the form of Vanessa and then tries to marry Eric later on in the film, she could look beautiful, but she just chooses not to. And I'm like, again, another reason why I love Ursula. I think she's fab. Plus, when she sort of says things were different when she lived in the palace, it's like, what did Triton do to her?
Yeah, you feel that like there might even be a slight Zeus thing going on because Triton is clearly Greek coded. He looks like Poseidon, right? And his name Triton actually comes from the ancient Greek name for a merman. And then if this is a scorned woman, that's possibly based slightly on characters like Medusa, you know, the Lamia is a woman who's transformed into a monster. You wonder what happened when she was in the palace and whether she was slighted or hurt by Triton, and whether that created the character that she is today. Again, fan fiction. Let's create some wicked fan fiction around that. I'm all for it.
Oh yeah, I just love the fact that we said we wouldn't do any tangents, and then we've just gone, how cool is Ursula? That tickles me. So aside from mermaids, because obviously they are cool, what would you say has been your favorite story so far that you've uncovered?
So I had this chapter that it was really weird because I almost was going to cut it because I was like, well, I don't know. I've done a number of chapters. I love all of them in different ways. There's one that I was writing about witches, and as I was writing about witches, demons came up a lot, and I was like, oh, I was going to do a whole chapter about demons, but actually maybe it's covered in witches. Maybe it's like a little bit superfluous. The demons chapter has become the longest chapter in the whole book. It's going to need to be cut down so much. But oh my God, I lost myself in demonology. I was reading about Aleister Crowley. I was reading, like, I've got like, thankfully, a friend called Chris who's lent me a number of his like, you know, original like 4,000-year-old demonology Babylonian textbooks, like basically like the Pokemon of demons. Like, here are the 73 demons you need to know and how to catch them. Love it. So that's the Lesser Key of Solomon. All of these, the Malleus Maleficarum, and just reading about succubuses, and basically falling down this weird rabbit hole where, like, yeah, obviously throughout history, demons have been anyone that's misbehaved or done anything strange is possessed by a demon. But like going into the actual demons themselves and seeing their like erotic sides, and how some demons insisted of taking the form of a woman despite being a lord of hell, how there is this really fascinating Mesopotamian ritual which was about casting the feminine out of a man who was perceived to be too feminine. So we're wondering here, is this a trans person who the community has decided they're trying to basically detransition, or is this a gay man who's a bit too flamboyant? But you can literally cast the feminine demon out of them. And all of this stuff got really, really fascinating to me, particularly when I was looking at how a number of queer or possibly queer writers and authors have treated demons. So whether it is Keats, and I'm going to get some hate mail for implying Keats is queer, but I don't care, come at me, writing about the Lamia, so it's a creature we mentioned before, but she's a demonic snake-like creature, to a number of lesbian poets in the sort of like early 1900s, late 1800s, writing about Lucifer and the fall of Lucifer, and clearly seeing something of themselves in that. So demons are a really fascinating one for me. And as part of this, I also kind of got to speak to someone who was willing to share his story of actually growing up and receiving an exorcism for being gay and the experience of that. So bringing it all the way to today. And I think it's also because I've been observing what's going on with the trans community today and the way it's being vilified in the media. Just shocking, really. But also not shocking because we've seen it all before. In the 1980s, we had what is called the Satanic Panic. If you've watched Stranger Things, then you know what I'm talking about, this obsession with D&D and heavy metal music. But again, the people that were often accused were accused of sodomy or of being gay. There was a whole group of lesbian women, Hispanic lesbian women, who were arrested for supposedly for child abuse. And then the story was completely fictional, and they've since been released. And so this, what I'm seeing now, this trans panic, it has a satanic edge to it. The way that we talk about transgender people, the way we perceive them, like we don't use the word devil or demon or Satan necessarily, or at least, well, I don't hear it in the UK, but I think in parts of America they definitely do. But it's about something has taken over your child. Something has made your child different. You don't understand them anymore. You need to get rid of it. You need to like speak its name to remove it. It's insidious. It's secret. There are secret meetings, and there are people trying to groom your children, and they're doing it through Disney films, and they're doing it through children's television. And it's kind of like a cult, and it's about mutilation and sacrifice. And it's like, it made everything come into frame. Like, wow, we're in the midst of another satanic panic. This just happens every 20, 30 years. We do this thing again. We just choose a slightly different victim, and we choose a slightly different rhetoric. So that chapter for me got very deep, and it went to some very like dark but interesting places. I got to like deal with some stuff through writing it, and I got to come to some really, I think, important realizations.
I know there's been a few threads on Twitter that I think you sort of see on the Romance and the Gothic Twitter account quite a lot of like sexy Lucifer, and how many statues there are of Lucifer. Where, I mean, I know there's one in the Retiro Park in Madrid, but he's kind of almost positioned as like, how do I put it? Like more attractive than some of the angels even, and it's kind of like the sculptor had some kind of agenda there, and
Yeah,
and
like
it was
twisted.
fascinating.
Yeah, twisted just to show off like his pecs, and then like a single tear. It's very beautiful. The face of Lucifer, when he's not like a monstrous goat creature, it is often like beautiful. Like this looks like an Abercrombie and Fitch model, right? This is someone who is chiseled, long hair, and this look of like sullen disdain. It's highly erotic, and I can totally understand why, you know, queer people would see themselves in this character. I totally get why gay and bisexual men would be attracted to this hot angel dude, right? But then there's also like the fact that lesbian and bisexual women were also exploring this idea too, like using Lucifer as a character to speak about their own lusts and desires is fascinating. It's really interesting. Fan fiction we mentioned earlier, right? It's a huge thing. It's been going on for years and years and years. In fact, it started with the original Star Trek, which, by the way, the very first example of fan fiction that we know of was Star Trek, which was matching Spock with Kirk. So it's always been quite a queer space. But we think about people rewriting Harry Potter or Twilight, and we imagine it's often teenagers or frustrated housewives or whatever. But this has been going on for a long time. The idea of taking a story and going, what if I expressed my own feelings, my own desires, but I used these characters to make it safer, to make it easier, or to at least find a way to play this out. It's been going on in the 17th century. You know, it's really interesting to see that. I think that, yeah, the devil and the demon, and just as I was writing this chapter, it was around the time that there were a few musicians like Sam Smith doing like a photo shoot where they were like dressed as a demon. And then I was thinking back to Lil Nas X and the entire music video of literally being a demon plummeting to hell. I was thinking about Lady Gaga. I was thinking about, wow, queer artists, this aesthetic, right, is something we are, you know, we're almost born knowing, and making it our own, and knowing it's going to rile people up a bit, and sort of enjoying it, taking power. Going back to Maleficent again with the incredible like horns on top of her head, but sort of sometimes, you know, there's loads of different kinds of activism, and sometimes being aggressive and vile and shouting is not always the best way to make change. But oh my god, does it not feel good sometimes to be the one to arrive late to the birthday party and crack your cane down and go, oh, I wasn't invited, well, I'm going to make your lives hell. Literally can feel really powerful. So I can see queer people not only finding solace in the character of the demon, but also flipping it and going like, oh, you think we're scary? Oh, we're going to be bloody terrifying, mate. That I find interesting, very interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned fairies earlier, and obviously regular listeners will know the kind of fairies that I cover on the show are not Tinkerbell, for want of a better word. So because obviously we'll blame the Victorians again. They were the ones who kind of cutified. They're so easy to blame for so many things. They kind of cutified fairies in a lot of ways and made them like these sweet little childlike creatures. So what's your take on them then? Considering like the folklore from where I'm from, it's very much like just don't mess with them. And if you do have to interact with them, follow their rules and everything will be fine.
Yeah, the original, you know, the Irish or Celtic fairy was more like a vampire. Was more monstrous and dangerous, like a demigod. And yeah, the Victorians definitely did a hatchet job. But what I've discovered is in doing this, they also created other opportunities for queer people too. So one of the reasons, there's many reasons why fairies became pretty and prissy. One of them was because the Victorians had an obsession with magic and spiritual beings, but they also, as we well know, were a very repressed, very religious society largely. And so to be able to enjoy these creatures, these beings, they had to make them safe, and they had to make them playful and childlike. And that was the way that they still got to play with darkness, but aesthetically make it safe. But one of the other reasons was because of the ballet and opera. So one of the original ballets, it's the oldest, I think, one of the oldest surviving ballets in terms of one that we can reproduce because we have all the music and everything, is called Il Silverde. And it's about a sylph, a fairy, coming down and marrying a man who's been forced to marry his cousin. And the people working in the theater, in the costumes, the dancers, the classic one being like the Russian ballet, right, was unsurprisingly full of homos. Like, oh my god, we were like we were the dancers, we were writing the music, we were creating the costumes. There was a huge amount, and also in the audience, who was coming to see the ballet? Well, loads of people. But also before Grinder, going to the ballet or even just waiting outside the theatre was a great way to meet men, the performers as well, who were often scantily clad, dancing around. And so the story of the fairy there becomes something that actually unites a lot of queer people. Now, it's really interesting because it becomes an insult and a slur that is used. You know, it's very dated nowadays. If someone calls me a fairy today, they're probably over 65. You know, like, okay, boomer. But the prior to this, we have examples of, like, for example, a writer talking about a nightclub in New York, and this is a person who we would probably describe as trans, because she or they were part of a group called Les Hermaphroditos, which their table that they kept in a particular restaurant where they would all meet was called Le Fay. So the land of Fae, and they would describe each other as fairies. So there was a sense of, almost before it was properly an insult, queer people were seeing these beautiful, these very neutered, sexy, shiny, sparkly fairies, and still seeing something of themselves in there. Also, in some of these performances, like Sleeping Beauty, you have the character of the dark fairy, Maleficent again. There she is. But she would often be played by a man in drag. And in fact, the Museum of London has one of the costumes from a performance of Sleeping Beauty of the dark fairy, who is incredible, called Carabosse as the character. This incredible costume that was worn by a male dancer, by a ballet dancer, a male ballet dancer. So cross-dressing was an opportunity. And then Peter Pan, right? All very much coded about fairies. For women who want to dress in male attire, Peter Pan. Peter Pan is a classic example of the principal boy character, a character where women get to dress as men. Now, many of these would have been just heterosexual women who were enjoying a time at the theatre where, you know, often there weren't many roles for women as main characters, but also, you know, let's go all tipping the velvet on this. If you are butch or lesbian or trans, what a fantastic opportunity to get to play a character where you get to have short hair and you get to wear like stockings rather than a long dress. And who were the adoring fans of these principal boys? Well, a lot of them were women. Women were obsessed with principal boys. They would write letters to them, basically love letters. In some ways, like the original sort of boy pop star was the principal boy, which was like, which women would lust after. So there is an intrinsic escapism and queerness in the Victorian fairy. I agree, like, we like our fairies like dripping blood and freaking people out and putting curses on people. Like, they're much more interesting there. And the Celtic story, you know, is really fascinating, of being like demons that have been cast out of hell. Angels have been cast out of heaven but haven't reached hell, and they end up stuck in between, that liminal state. But I do think we can be a bit unfair on the Victorian fairy. Like, she or they are quite interesting too. There's a reason why the Victorians did this. They were still seen as quite sexy and subversive, and they were still very, very important for queer counterculture.
I'm just thinking, so really that adds a whole extra layer to David Bowier's Jareth and Labyrinth, where that kind of combines the two. So you then have like sexy Victorian fairy, but you also kind of don't want to mess with them either.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we are today, right? We've mixed all these things together. So if you watch any like teen supernatural thing, the fairies, they're always really hot, right? But they are dangerous. We've somehow, the dangerous side of fairies has come back. We're now trying to rediscover that dangerous side to fairies. You know, I think a bit of Terry Pratchett's We Free Men. He was really good at recapturing what fairies were originally, monstrous. And I think that's, you know, that's true for pretty much any folkloric character you can find. It's that blend of sexy, subversive, and dangerous that makes them interesting. Like, that's why we have Twilight and the A Million One ripoffs, is because we love a magic bad boy. That's just like, right? Who doesn't love a magic bad boy?
That needs to go on a t-shirt.
Yeah, I mean, I'm already like sell it. Could I sell this? Should I start an Etsy? Yeah. No, I think like it's so cool today to be really scathing about Twilight, and I get it. Like I think it's cack. It's not for me. It wasn't written for me. You know, it's not for me. But I also think we have this one of the similarities that I find really interesting between queer, particularly like queer men, adults, and teenage girls is society will look down on anything that they enjoy. If a teenage girl is like, I really like this, everyone is ready to say how stupid it is, how dumb it is. Oh, eye roll, it's been done before. Sparkly vampires, gross. And we don't do the same thing to teenage heterosexual boys. So fairies, anything a girl likes becomes crap. Anything girls say that they like, society decides to make trashy or camp or stupid. And it tends to only be gay men that continue to enjoy it. Like, who have you got singing along to Frozen? Like, who's the audience for that? Right? Like, between 6 and 13-year-old girls and gay men. Those are the people singing to Frozen. And there's something interesting about who society decides is tacky, tells you a lot about who society values, which I find interesting. Like, who's buying unicorn merchandise? There are two communities there, and they do not overlap. But it's really interesting to me, yeah, that these characters have become attractive and interesting again. There's a resurgence. I think we've done it a bit too much. So for about 10 years, we won't have any glittery vampires, but they'll be back again. And they'll come back in a slightly different flavor, in a slightly different form. We can't seem to leave that myth alone. We get bored of it, put it to one side, but they'll be back.
Yeah, I suppose when you think about it, or even like when the resurrected like interview the vampire and stuff, and you know when they've you know they keep coming back to it, and I always think the vampire is a really interesting character, particularly with like the British obsession with them when we don't really have them in our folklore. I mean, there are a couple of examples of bloodsuckers. I mean, there's a couple up where I am. There's one over in Cumbria, but it's not like a dominant folkloric myth in the UK,
yeah.
But yet we seem obsessed with them.
Yeah, it's for vampire, you've got a really interesting story there because, you know, arguably the original vampire was Lord Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, who inspired the writing of The Vampire by Dr. Polidori, who was one of his sycophants, or one of his, you know, lover boys, whatever, however you want to see it, who then that story inspired Bram Stoker. The reason the vampire is well dressed, right, and like has a good haircut is partly because of you know, Lord Byron, who, going on the accounts, everyone was just falling over irrespective of gender. And then the mother of the vampire is, you know, if you go back far enough, we're talking about Lilith in the Garden of Eden. Before Eve there was Lilith, and she refused to lie for Adam, got kicked out of Eden, and turned into a succubus, wherein all her children became vampires in some telling. So vampires again have this queer origin, and they went through a bit of a, you know, a spruce up. For a long time they were just hideous undead rotting monsters, and then suddenly they become wealthy austere Europeans with big castles and funny accents and a dislike for garlic. So yeah, all stories change. They always change. And I think part of me, I totally agree. The Victorians did a hatchet job on a lot of things, but also we sometimes are a bit cruel to the Victorians. Like, firstly, like, they were into some really kinky stuff, and they were having a lot of fun. Like, underneath those crinolines, all kinds of things were going on. Like, I can tell you about the unicorn erotica that I've come across. Like, wow. They were not as repressed as we like to think they are, outwardly so maybe. And also, they were only doing what every group of people has ever done to folklore, which is to take it, change it, and pass it on.
This is true. So I suppose there's a question of who sort of has the authority, I suppose would be the best word, to look at these kind of histories, because I mean anyone can look at history from their own lens. I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting is if you try and go back, particularly with folklore, and you look at it from a class-based perspective, people people kind of sort of accept that in a way, because you do point out that obviously what class was the person doing the collecting, and how disparaging are they based on what was the class of the people they were collecting from. Again, thank you, Victorians. But I suppose, would you like to see more folklorists and historians kind of taking your approach, or do you think that it's best undertaken by people within the LGBTQ plus community, or do you think it's a kind of thing where, like, if more people sort of were a bit more open to lived experiences, then it might we might not have the same societal problems that we do?
I mean, like all of the above. So let me try and break that down a little bit, though. So when you are looking at something like folklore through a lens, you are looking at through a lens. Like, my book is not saying folklore is only queer and mermaids are trans actually and fairies are gay actually. You can't have them. This is where it gets really odd. And I'm going to make a real, so if you're cis, heterosexual, apologies, I love you all. Many of my friends are cis and heterosexual. But sometimes collectively, heteronormative society has this thing about ownership. Like, we own this, this is ours. And if you go over to something and go, oh, there's actually a queer reading of that, the response is, no, it's ours. And you're like, I'm not saying it's not yours. I'm saying there is a queer reading of this. No, and they almost like the grip gets stronger on it. It's like, look, folklore, history is not a cake. When you come to, I'm going somewhere with this. When you come to a cake and you take a slice away and eat it, the slice is gone. And the more people that take a slice, the less cake there is until there's no cake left. That's not how history works. In fact, the more it's additive, the more people that look at it, the more cake there is. So it's like a different process. When you are looking at queer history or folklore through a queer lens, you're not changing it. You're literally adding a layer, a different perspective. Every creature I've written about, you could write a book from the perspective of people with disabilities. You could write it from neurodivergence. You could write it about class, about race, about religion. Any identity or perspectives you could imagine, you could write and flesh out a full book. And that's really interesting and valid. In terms of who gets to do this, I really think that queer history is just history, and I'm actually working really hard to do myself out of a job. I love being a queer historian, and I love that I get to write about things that affect my community. I love that I have a connection to the stories I'm telling. I love that. That feels great. But I hate being a queer historian, because why can't I just be a bloody historian? And, you know, when it comes to the point where traditional everyday history is inclusive of all these perspectives, where people feel free to look at all these different things with nuance and eloquence, that's going to be amazing. And I want us to get there. The issue that I have is I'm reading books that are incredible, like really well-researched books. I'm not going to name any names. And like, they have been like the backbone to my research, but there's nothing queer in there. And for me, I'm like, how do you write a book about witchcraft and fairies, and like it's this thick, and there's nothing? Like, how do you do that? And for me, that's the frustration that I'm kind of responding to. Like, the stories are so there, and they're so sometimes so obvious and so interesting. I wish we could all write about them. I think I totally understand why cisgender heterosexual writers, historians, or researchers might be nervous about stepping into the scape for making mistakes, doing things wrong. I'm a white historian. I'm writing about Indigenous stories sometimes, and I need some sensitivity readers. I need to be really bloody careful about how I throw my weight around, what I should and shouldn't be allowed to say. I get that. So if you're not speaking from a frame of reference from your own identity, yeah, you're going to have to be careful, but not so careful that you pretend we don't exist. You can always ask for our input and advice. You can always ask for someone to read over something. Just because I'm writing about a book about queer folklore, like, there's class in there, there's race in there. Like, how do you write about sexuality and not write about these other things? And that's where I would love to get to. Like, yeah, you know, if your fascination is railways and you're writing about, cool, excellent, go ahead, locomotive historians, love that for you. But like, every now and then, like, just keep that lens in your back pocket, because when you come across those two men or those two women and then you write they were like sisters. Like, think about what you're doing there. I'm sure you don't mean to, and I'm sure there's no harm intended, but if you have that lens, it just gives you an extra tool in your arsenal to do inclusive and good history. There you go, soapbox away. That's
I think that's one of the things, I must admit, I've had this soapbox moment just about folklore in general, that people try and look at everything as an either or. And this just goes for the internet in general. And like when people argue with me because they've never heard a particular bit of folklore, so therefore it can't be real. And it's like, where's this either or coming from? Folklore has always been a both and things can be both one thing and another, and that's like the point of it. And I think if more people sort of took, and not to say that people don't, but I mean just in life in general, if more people accepted that two things can be true at once, I think life would be a lot easier.
Yeah, it's a really challenging thing with history, isn't it? Because we're all, and we should do like real authentic history. We shouldn't make things up. We shouldn't misquote things. We shouldn't like put things together that don't go together. We shouldn't assert our beliefs on people that did not share them. That's bad. That's crappy history. At the same time, like, who was in Henry VIII's bedchamber that is like written an actual description of what was in Henry VIII's bedchamber? Like, nobody. We do not have that source. We don't have it. So every history written about Henry VIII, about his relationships, about his wives, is written by historians who are doing the best they can with what they have available. And guess what? They come to all different kinds of conclusions. And the fact is, yeah, there was a real thing. What happened? We may never know, unless we have a time machine, exactly what that is. The best you can do is this patchwork of different voices and different perspectives. And so someone having a different perspective on a historical event, on the story, as long as it is not motivated by some bad agenda, it is literally someone just making stuff up or doing bad research. What you're just getting is someone putting the same puzzle pieces together and coming to a slightly different conclusion. And that sadly is history. If people are looking for history and they're looking for like fact, solid, iron, unchangeable, mate, you're not going to find it. And if you get to folklore, as you know, it's so loosey goosey. Like, I'm writing about the Greek myth of Lycon, the origin of the Greek king of Arcadia who was transformed into a wolf. There are at least 6 different versions. There are at least 6 different versions that I can find that are so different. Sometimes he gets turned into a wolf. Sometimes him and his sons get turned into a wolf. Sometimes he gets turned into a wolf and then he eats his own sons. Sometimes Zeus throws lightning bolts. Sometimes his son is called Nyctimus. Sometimes it is a completely different guy who is actually the son of Callisto from the myth I told. It's like, which one is the real myth? And the answer is, as you said, both and. It's the best you can do, both and.
I suppose when you look at like our tendency towards reboots and adaptations and sequels and reimaginings, you think, so if we keep doing this, I mean, imagine if you try to say who's the definitive Dracula. I mean, I would obviously go Christopher Lee, but like that's my personal opinion, just based on my experience, with Dracula. Sounds weird, but you know what I mean. It's like if someone like 300 years in the future is then trying to figure out which is the, obviously you would go, I suppose, Bram Stoker, the original text, but so many people have taken it and run with it. Why would we assume that the Greeks wouldn't have done the same?
Yeah. And they did, and also it feels like they had less of a problem with it than we do. They were loosey goosey, and they kind of knew it. They were all telling their different stories. They were all kind of like overlapping. Like, you have in ancient Greek and Roman religions, you have like gods that literally contradict each other, and they'll have an Egyptian Isis on their pedestal next to Apollo, then a pagan god, even like a Hindu god. Like in Pompeii, they found these like fascinating combinations. They were picking and choosing whatever worked for them. And these are stories that they get written down sometimes, thankfully, because that means we get to read them. But they were spoken, and who knows the versions that were being spoken? Like, who knows what was the most popular story in the town? May have been completely different to what Plutarch wrote down. It is messy, and I guess the best thing to go is, guess what, guys? Humans pretty messy. That's like the conclusion to my book. Humans are messy. we've been having all kinds of sex. We've been identifying with all kinds of gender throughout time in history. You can't draw a line anywhere. It doesn't go. And that is reflected in the stories we tell. We still tell stories of messy, dangerous creatures because we are messy, dangerous creatures, which is so much more interesting to me than saying the mermaid represents this. It's this. Scroll down, 6 million other things that the mermaid represents. For every person that's told that story, it represents something. Yeah, there are trends though, and there are interesting lines to presume. It is, yeah, it's messy spaghetti. That doesn't mean there aren't strands that you can follow. There we go. That's a new one. We've done cake and spaghetti so far.
Oh, I like that. So other than your book, where would you recommend people can go if they want to learn more about queer readings of folklore or mythology? Or would you recommend, particularly for my queer listeners, because obviously I do know that I've got some fabulous sort of gay, trans, non-binary listeners, so shout out to all of them. They might want to have a go at their own, but where would you recommend people sort of go to start?
There's a lot of different places that you can look for this stuff. There are books that do queer versions of folklore. They are few and far between, and they're very expensive, and they tend to be rather academic, which is one of the reasons why I want to write the book that I'm writing at the moment. A lot of it is on research papers. If you are lucky enough to be part of a university, that's one thing. Other thing is Google Scholar is your friend. You can find free PDFs. Search mythical creature and queer, and you will find a whole host of stuff there. So that's really interesting. You can see people are actually doing research in this area. And some of it is actually surprisingly readable and really good fun. I was going to say something really controversial here. Wikipedia. Now, with a massive cap. Yes, exactly right. Massive caveat. Always go down to the footnotes first. And also, like, whilst writing this book, I've had to make 3 requests for changes on Wikipedia articles because they are so inaccurate. Right? When you actually read the source, don't ever quote a Wikipedia article as it is and believe that that's a great way to lose a Twitter argument, just so you know. Footnotes though, and you can then find often full text like ancient Greek and Roman texts that have been put up by universities, and you can actually read through the full sources. That's really, really good. I would say I'm currently reading a book called Cartographies of Desire by, I'm leaning over to see if I can see it, Gregory, and his name is really Plingfelder. That's a great name, isn't it? Cartographies of Desire, which is about Japanese sexuality. And it's fantastic. It looks at everything from historical figures through to like yokai. So the yokai obviously being like the equivalent of demons and fairy tale creatures in Japanese folklore. There's some great stuff about the kappa as a homosexual creature. Like, I love that. So that's what I'm reading at the moment. I highly suggest that. There are other books. There's a book called Queer Magic, which is an exploration of magic from queer perspectives. There's another book called It Came from the Closet. It Came from the Closet. And it's a collection, an anthology of stories of queer people, talking about horror films and horror movie characters and how they resonate with them. So that's been really, really interesting. And then, like, there are whole books about witches and fairies that I could recommend. Like, Richard Hutton has done a really great compendium on witches, but I would say read it knowing that he's a really, really well-researched anthropologist, but he's very much like this cis white straight dude. Like, there are bits of passages where you go, oh God, that's an interesting way to talk about sexual abuse, and okay, that's clearly gay, but you've decided to skip over that. But if you go with that lens, then you've got a great resource. So those are some of the things I would recommend.
And also, is your book still, because I know obviously Unbound has a slightly different funding model than most publishers that I think people will be used to. So you're fully funded for the book now? Fully funded.
In fact, we're aiming for 200%. Which and doesn't mean, I know this gets really silly. So 100% funded, which means the book is happening, like it's totally happening, and I'm having to write it because it's definitely happening. You can do a pre-order, and when you go a pre-order, it moves the percentage up above 100%. And the reason we do that is pre-orders I'm only very new to the publishing world, but they are so important for getting books into bookshops and to like basically when it comes to publication date to go, ooh, look how big this book is. Don't just sell it on the very back shelf, make a big deal out of it. So as lame as that sounds to beg for pre-orders, like if you're interested, grab a pre-order, you will get a copy. I cannot tell you when it's coming out. I'm literally not allowed to tell you, but we're not like, honestly, this is not going to be like years and years. If I don't write the book, I'm in like loads of trouble. So it's in my best interest to get beyond this. I am at the 50% point of the first draft, just so you know. So it's all happening at a good pace.
Cool. And I'll put the link to that in the, I don't know why I'm pointing as if people don't know where show notes are. I'll put that in there, and then people can then just click links and so on, rather than having to go Googling, because who knows what people might end up finding with Google and its random algorithm. And if you try using Bing, all bets are off. No, that's been really cool. Obviously, I haven't pledged yet, but I will, because you know I love buying books and I love seeing new readings on stuff as well.
Oh, thank you. I won't check, so I won't know if you have or haven't, but like I occasionally, that little percentage like creeping up, it's good. It's like a little bit of pressure on me, like, get it done, Sacha, get it done.
No pressure then. But yeah, no, that's been really cool. It's been really lovely having you on. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.